And I just realized these recordings are these meetings are supposed to be recorded automatically, and this one didn't record. So I just started that. So this recording will be missing the first part of that, but that's not really that critical. If you want to go back and pick up any tips or whatever, most of it is going to be in the second half of the class and not the first. So I think we're probably okay there, but we are recording this part. So I want to go back just for a second and look at our, I went through and kind of pulled out an image for, I'm trying to move my screens around, guys. Give me a second here. Because I do want to award a couple of points for this week. And so all of you, for the most part, either performed the assignment correctly or did something a little more unique and unusual. But there are a couple, I think, that went just a little beyond that, that I'm going to probably reward here a little bit. So I could literally almost give everybody a point for something that they've done here. But I'm going to look at 3. So, and they're right through here. This one, and this one. So I think it's Jacob, Eva, and is it Ashton? Is that yours? I think all 3 of those took the editing process to an extra level. Cool Rat almost got almost got one. I just like the sunglasses on the rat, but I had to realize that I'm going to back up and look at technique here. So as far as what you guys did for editing, I think those 3 probably for me stand out a little bit more than the rest. But like I said, as far as doing the assignment, you guys all got it. I'm just making notes of those here before we move on. And the 3rd one was Ashton. All right. And I'll give you halfway through the semester, we'll do, I'm not sure how we'll do this. We normally do it face-to-face. We do a little review one-on-one to kind of let you know where you're at and if there's anything you need to improve on or whatever. If we're going to do that remotely, I'll figure out a way to do it. And I'll let you know where you stand on the points and all of that at that point. So let me stop sharing because we're going to go into another area here. All right, let me close that up. It's a lot of screen juggling when you're doing this. All right, so I'm going to start to share this screen. And try to move you guys around where I can see you. When I go into full screen mode on this app, it does not show me my cursor, and that is a problem. Let me get out of this for a second. Really want to be able to see. Okay, now I've got you. All right, that should work. Okay, so we're going to do a little review of some of the things that we've been working on. This was stuff we looked at very first week. We looked at this. We talked about the 4 things that you need to understand in order to control your images. One is white balance. We just pretty much successfully nailed white balance. I think that was an easy one for you guys. Nobody really seemed to have too much of a problem with it. Determines the overall color balance of the image. We've talked a lot about that. The ISO, which is really, it's really, can think of it more like sensitivity, okay? The creative stuff is always your aperture and your shutter speed. Aperture, again, we'll see here in a second, determines the background blur. Shutter speed determines the subject or camera motion. And if you can't get those numbers where you want them because of you have a minimal amount of light, then your ISO is basically your sensitivity. It's like turning up the volume. So think of it that way. It might make it a little easier. Shutter speed, again, it affects the exposure and the ability to hold the camera steady. It also affects subject movement. Like last week, we did an experiment with, moving subjects or freezing subjects or whatever. So shutter speed does that. Aperture, on the other hand, affects the depth of field and how much of the image is in focus. So those four things are the main things as far as being able to totally control your image. Now, if you're in a full manual exposure, which is what we have been for the last couple of weeks, you have full control over all of these elements, and you can completely control the image. We're going to look at, near the end of the class today, at probably a more useful method of photographing rather than full manual. But the full manual was necessary to kind of get you guys to understand how these things all work together. So as far as white balance, like we said, if black, white, and gray are correct, everything else is correct. Which white balance should you use? Well, auto will work for most things. You just have to be aware that if you shoot multiple images of the same basic setup, any little change in that image, even moving your camera a little right or left to show something in the image that wasn't in the previous image, is more than likely going to affect your white balance. It's going to make them not match. So personally, I prefer one of the other ones. You could set it to daylight and leave it there forever and not have a problem, because like we've said, you can adjust those files afterwards and not, not lose any quality or anything by doing that. So it doesn't matter what the preview on the back of your camera looks like. You can always go in later and in one step white balance those images. I use the Kelvin temperature at the bottom, the K. And again, it's set for what is essentially daylight. But if you do use auto, just be aware that you're going to want to use something, have some kind of a target or something that you know is neutral that you can put in that image so that you can, or in your first image, so that you can white balance all the images. Let's take a look at exposure for a second again, because that's what we really spent most of this first month on. So I have a question. If you've determined that the correct exposure for a scene is f8 at a 60th of a second at ISO 100, those are your three exposure triangle legs, but you want to change your f-stop or your aperture to f2.8, the question is what else has to change? So you're at f8, 60th of a second at ISO 100. And if you look at the chart, so we'd be looking at, in the middle of this chart, f8, right below it a 60th of a second, and then the ISO is ISO 100, so we're over on the left. So if I want to change the aperture from f8 to f2.8, and I'm in manual exposure, I need to change something else to keep that exposure consistent. What is it that I need to change, and by how much? So that's the question. This is sort of like a mini quiz. Anybody want to take a stab at it? We're going from F8 to F2. And I don't know why. I didn't make this chart. They put commas instead of periods in those f-stop numbers. I'm not sure why. But anyway, F8 to F2.8 is what we're doing. So what else has to change to keep the exposure consistent?
Bring the ISO down.
So where would you put the ISO?
800.
Okay, so you're half right and you're half wrong. What you got right was you recognized that going from f8 to f2.8 is 3 stops difference. However, you just moved the ISO 3 stops, but in the wrong direction. Because you made
Oh, my bad, my bad, my
they
bad.
both went brighter. So I'm glad you did that though, because think about this for a second. F8 to f2.8, we made the image 3 stops brighter. If you want to use the ISO, you can't really do it, can you? Because you only have 1 stop on your ISO. So what else? There's 2 answers here basically to make this work. Two ways it would make this work. You could move the ISO to ISO 50, but that's
Wait,
not
are you
enough.
going from F8 to 2.8 or 2.8 to F8?
No, from 8 to 2.8. So I've just made the image 3 stops brighter.
Okay.
So yeah, you don't want to make the ISO 3 stops brighter, and you don't have 3 stops darker. You only have 1 stop. Because most cameras will not go below, well, some of them won't even go to 50.
What was the ISO before?
100.
Oh, okay.
So if you took the ISO to 50, that only accounts for 1 of those 3 stops. How do you account for the other 2? Your shutter speed was a 60th of a second. I think Chris, you're muted if you're trying to say anything.
No, I'm just trying to figure it out real quick.
Okay.
So it was 100 at
Decrease the, shutter
F8.
speed.
What was that? Was that you, Eva?
Yeah, decrease the shutter speed.
To change it from 160 to what?
1/1000.
Not quite. You went in the right direction, but you went too far.
Okay.
Remember, from F8 to F2.8, if you
Okay.
look at the chart, that's only 3 steps.
Yeah.
You went
So-
4.
I went 4.
Yeah. So if you went from a 60th to a 500th, that accounts for that 3 stops. Or like Chris wanted to mess with the ISO. So if you went from ISO 100 to ISO 50, then you would only take the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to a 250th of a second. So you get 1 stop back in your ISO and you get the other 2 in your shutter speed. So the 2 things you want to remember are which side of the scale is brighter and which side is darker. And if you've gone a certain number of stops in one direction, you need to go an equal number of stops in the other direction to compensate. And sometimes you can get that with just changing one thing, and sometimes you have to change more than one thing. Because like in this case, we saw we don't have enough ISO on the bottom end to be able to do that. All right, so this whole thing right here, it's going to come up again and again and again. This is really the key. This is the one thing, if you get to the end of this course and you understand how this chart works and are able to figure this out in your head, I consider that a win. That is the main thing right here, is being able to understand all of this. All right, so just as way of explaining that, there's a seesaw at place. If your aperture widens, your shutter speed must increase to compensate. And when I say increase, in this case, if the aperture widens, that means it's opening up, it's letting more light in, it's getting brighter. The shutter speed has to increase, meaning the numbers have to increase. So in this case, we went from a 60th to either a 500th or a 250th, depending on whether or not we were using the ISO. And then the opposite is also true. As the aperture closes, your shutter speed has to decrease or get slower in order to compensate. So if the aperture closes and lets less light in, the shutter speed has to get longer to let more light in order to compensate. And it says you also may be able to change the ISO in order to keep the shutter, if the ISO of the original image had been 800, then yeah, we would have been able to go down to, 800, 400, 200, 100, and get all 3 stops back with just the ISO without changing the shutter speed. We just didn't have that much range because we were at 100 already. So here's a little chart that kind of gives you a little look at the possible combinations. So what it's saying here is that if a 60th of a second at f8 is the same as all of those combinations listed below, will let the exact same amount of light into the camera that a 60th of a second at f8 does. So the first one, you notice the shutter speed is longer, but the aperture is smaller. So we've added a stop with the shutter speed, and we've taken it away with the aperture. So this one got brighter, this one got darker. And all of them are like that, just in varying degrees. An eighth of a second, for example, is 3 stops brighter on the shutter speed, and f22 is 3 stops darker on the aperture. So any of these combinations will let exactly the same amount of light into the camera, and that's why I'm saying that you have a lot of flexibility when you go to decide creatively. You know, you have to decide, what is it that I want to do? Do I want more blur in the background? Do I want more sharpness in the background? Well, that'll determine your f-stop. And if you decide, well, I want more sharpness in the background and you want to shoot it at f16, that means your shutter speed is going to have to really slow down in order to compensate for that. So these little exposure basic things are things that you want to get to the point eventually after another, what do we got, 10 or 11 weeks, where you can sit and figure this out in your head. If I say, we're going to change this from here to here, then you should know automatically that it means we're changing something else from here to there and know where to go with it. All right, so now we're going to talk about an exposure mode that we've only touched on. So we've been working in manual mode, and most of you, the cameras, you know, if you look at your little wheel on the top of your camera that looks like the wheel in this diagram, you'll have these. You've got all these image zones at the bottom, which I told you pretty much you can ignore those because they don't really tell you what they're doing. You can figure it out, but it's not giving you any control. There's an automatic zone, and then we've been in manual. But what we're going to look at now and what we're going to start to play with is aperture priority. You can use shutter priority if your brain works that way, but aperture priority actually achieves both of those without having to change it. So in aperture priority, let me run down the differences. In manual mode, you control everything. You set the ISO, you set the aperture, you set the shutter speed, and they have to match up with the lighting conditions that you have in order to get a proper exposure. It basically disables your camera meter. It turns it off. Doesn't work at all. In aperture priority or shutter priority, you can use your camera's meter. But what you do is you set, let's say we're going to go to aperture priority, and it'll either be listed as AE or AV. Don't ask me why AV means aperture priority, but it does. It'll be listed as that on your button somewhere. When you go to aperture priority, for example, now your meter is activated and you set the aperture. You're also going to set the ISO, but that's something that you do at the very beginning based on the lighting. If I'm outside, probably going to set it at ISO 100 or 200 because I've got plenty of light, and forget about it. Now I'm in aperture priority mode. I'm going to say, what do I want the background to look like? Do I want it to be blurry? Do I want it to be sharp? And I'm going to set the f-stop according to that. So here's what the camera's doing in this mode. It's going to keep your f-stop wherever you set it, but it's going to adjust your shutter speed automatically to give you a proper exposure, or as proper exposure as it can. Remember that your camera's meter, when it looks at the scene that it's looking at, is assuming that it's looking at a gray card. It's looking at that gray target that we've been playing with. Because in reality, the reason that gray target exists, in reality, the average of most outdoor scenes, when you average out the luminance and the brightness values, they average out to about an 18% gray. So your camera's meter is just assuming that everything it's seeing is like that. But if you look right now, if you guys can see the gallery view and look at Jacob's webcam, so he's got a lot of white around him and he's wearing something dark. The camera meter, which it has in his case, if you can look at it, it's actually overexposed his background because it's trying to raise his level, you know, the dark clothing that he's wearing, it's trying to raise that up. So the meter's not really working properly. You have to be able to understand that the camera thinks everything in front of it is 18% gray. but that's okay. There's still a way to do this very simply and very easily. I just want you to understand, in aperture priority mode, you first set the ISO, kind of leave it alone unless your lighting conditions change. Then you concentrate on the aperture. Whatever it is you want to set it at, the camera will adjust your shutter speed. If you're like, oh, I'm going to shoot this at f4, and then you take a picture and you're like, no, I'm going to go to f8, you change it to f8, the camera will automatically adjust your shutter speed the way we were just doing in that chart. It does that for you automatically, but it's assuming that you're looking at a very normal scene. Your scene could still be over or underexposed based on what it actually is. So how is that helpful? So there is a control on your cameras called exposure compensation. And if you look, this little plus and minus icon somewhere on your camera, you're either going to see a button like that or a menu item or something. And typically the way it works is if you press your shutter button halfway to activate your meter, then usually the top thumb wheel on your camera adjusts your aperture, or I'm sorry, your exposure compensation. And here's what it's doing. So you set your ISO, you've now set your aperture, you're in aperture priority mode, you take a picture and it's too bright, it's overexposed. So what you do without changing anything else on the camera, you can take that exposure compensation dial and just rotate it to make the image darker. That's all you have to do. And what the camera is doing in aperture priority mode, it's not changing your aperture because that's the priority. You're telling it, I want it to be at f4. So it's not going to change that. But what it's going to do is say, okay, the meter says at f4, you should be shooting at a 60th of a second, but you're telling me that it's too bright, so I'm going to change the shutter speed to 1/25. So every time you move your exposure compensation, it's actually changing your shutter speed, but it's still using your meter. Does that make sense? So the meter is giving you a starting point, and you're just refining it using this exposure compensation. Once you get used to this, this is a really fast way to shoot and nail your exposure, because literally you just take a shot, look at it, too bright or too dark, bang, rotate that exposure compensation, shoot another one, and you've got it. So it's really fast, really easy, and it doesn't require a lot of thought. This little chart that you're seeing in front of you, I've uploaded this into the resources folder on Sakai, so you can download this and take a look at it at your leisure. It just basically is telling you the same thing that I just told you. What happens when you rotate that plus or minus. And typically you have about a 3-stop plus and a 3-stop minus. So it's a 6-stop range, which is pretty big, that you can rotate and change your exposure. If you put your camera, and I don't recommend this, but if you put your camera in live view mode, where you're actually looking at, the live view on your viewfinder, and you do the exposure compensation, most cameras will actually show you, it'll actually get darker or brighter. If you're not doing that, you just have to take a picture and evaluate the picture, that's all. So for a short period of time here now, the next exercise that we do, that your assignment for this week, when we get to that point, I'm going to have you shoot in aperture priority mode. If you find that your brain works more along the lines of shutter priority, that's fine. It really, the two work very similarly. It's just whatever you feel is the most important decision to make based on what you're shooting. If I'm shooting an action, a sports action, I probably would want to be in shutter priority. Although if I'm in aperture priority, the camera is still going to show me what shutter speed it's going to shoot at. And I can just adjust my aperture until I get a faster shutter speed. So the two, they're different, but they work very much the same way. You have to decide how you prefer. For me, aperture priority is what I have my camera set to all the time, unless I'm in the studio or if I'm trying to do something very creative and I want full control. Most of the time when I'm shooting portraits, I'm in aperture priority. Very fast, very simple way to shoot. All right, what are we going to? All right, so this is what we just talked about. Manual exposure bypasses the camera's meter. Aperture or shutter priority allows you to use the camera's meter. And in aperture priority, the exposure compensation dial will keep the aperture constant while the camera adjusts the shutter speed automatically, and the reverse is true in shutter priority. It'll keep the shutter speed constant and the aperture will fluctuate up and down based on where you put that exposure compensation. Now, the one thing I will tell you to be careful of is when you change your exposure compensation, it'll stay there. And so you can put your camera away and come back a few days later and pick it up. And unless you reset everything, if let's say your exposure compensation was -2 for the last thing you shot, it'll still be there. So it's always a good idea to check. There is a visual on the LCD on the top of your camera that you'll see a 0 in the middle and a +2 or 3 and a -2 and 3. And there's a little hashtag, or not hashtag, but a hash mark. And that's showing you where your exposure compensation is set. So you just want to keep an eye on that to make sure that, when you start out, you're at 0, and then you can adjust it however you feel you need to after that. Any questions on any of that? That's a lot of, again, it's a lot of technical jargon. But once you've done it a few times, it really does become second nature. All right, so you'll use manual exposure when you want total control over your image. Use aperture priority when the background blur is the most important thing, and use shutter priority when the shutter speed or controlling the speed of the action is the most important thing. But again, you can get that same effect in aperture priority mode just by watching where your shutter speed is when you push your button halfway and your meter activates. It'll tell you, where your shutter speed is. And if you're trying to freeze action and it's telling you that you're at a 30th of a second, that's probably not fast enough. So you just open the aperture and that's going to change your shutter speed. It'll show you that right in the camera. All right, unless there's any questions on that, it is time to forge ahead and break some new ground here. So we're going to start talking about composition. And there are a number of compositional elements that we're going to look at, and I'm going to break them up. We're going to do half of them this week and half of them next week. There is a chart that outlines all 10 or 11 of them that is also, in the resources folder on Sakai, so you can download that. But we're going to concentrate on half of them this week and half of them next week, just so we don't overwhelm ourselves. And there are more than 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever. There are a lot of compositional elements. We're going to look at the most used ones, the most basic ones. We're not going to get into some of the really bizarre ones that use, the Fibonacci spiral or the Bacher saddle, if you've ever heard terms like that. They work. They're really interesting. The Fibonacci ones especially, because it's amazing when you start realizing how often we see those patterns. We see them in nature, we see them in flowers, we see them in conch shells, we see them in even galaxies and star patterns. We see that. We see it in architecture. The Greeks used those fundamentals of the Fibonacci numbers in a lot of the architecture that they use. It's aesthetically pleasing to the eye, all of it is, and it shows up everywhere. There's a reason for it. We don't really know why, but there is. But anyway, that's a little bit beyond what we're going to get into right now. We're going to talk about some of the basic ones. Very first one, and we'll go through the list and then we'll back up and look at some examples. So rule of thirds is probably one that you've heard of, and it basically just involves dividing your screen or your viewfinder into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, which will create 4 impact points. Where those lines or intersect with each other, it creates 4 impact points. And typically, if you have your subject at one of those impact points, it's going to be compositionally stronger. We'll look at examples in a minute. Balance is another one. Let's just run through the list and then we'll look at the examples. Contrast, leading lines, convergence. And those are the 5 that we're going to look at this week. Next week, we're going to look at use of diagonals, framing, perspective, simplicity, symmetry, and viewpoint. And there's some similarity in some of these, viewpoint and perspective, for example, as well as convergence and leading lines. Sometimes the lines get blurred between those. They really are separate descriptions for them, but there's some crossover too. So this chart is in the resources folder. You can grab a copy of this and hang on to it. And it's the top 5 that we're going to look at right now. So with the rule of thirds, most people, when they first get a camera and they first start taking pictures, because there's a crosshair right in the middle of that viewfinder, that's where they put everybody. And if you take a picture of a person, typically they're going to do it. If you look at my webcam right now, that's pretty much what you're going to see. The head right in the middle of the frame on a horizontal frame, and you've got all this space around me, which really doesn't do anything as far as telling a story. If I come over here and I move to the intersection of those lines of the thirds, it makes it a little more powerful. It also tells a little more of a story. Now, the background elements that are behind me are balanced with me, and you might look at that and go, oh, okay, so he's a musician. He likes music or something like that. If you're just looking at this, there's just all this stuff, and I've got this big closet here, which means nothing, okay? But compositionally, we've just improved that image a great deal. So is it better to have things centered? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Let's look at examples. So this is an example of the rule of thirds. You can see that the image has been divided into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and the subject has been placed on the intersection of both of those impact points on the right-hand side. So the upper left, where they intersect in the upper left, that's typically called quadrant 1. Coming across to the right is quadrant 2. The lower left is quadrant 3, and the lower right is quadrant 4. Well, we won't get into which one is more powerful because it depends on the subject matter. But in this case, if you look at this image and you envision this dead center, it doesn't have as much impact. What this does in this case, it allows us, in Western society, we read from left to right. So this allows us to come in to an image from the left-hand side, let our eye travel from the left to the subject on the right, and then it stops us there. And in this case, allows us to kind of do a circular thing and rotate back around to the subject because of the lines coming in from the right. But this is a much stronger image composed this way than dead center in the frame. Let's look at some more. Even in a portrait, you notice that his eyes, his dominant eye is very near the impact point in quadrant number 2. And both eyes are right along that upper 1/3 marker. And again, he's looking to the left, our left. And it's kind of letting us feel that he's not crowded. Like if he were on the other side, and he was looking out of the left side of the frame the way he is, but he was much closer to the edge, that creates tension because there's no place for his gaze to go. You know what I mean? He's too close to where he is. It's like a boat, and this can be done for effect sometimes, but it's like a speedboat, and you photograph a speedboat, typically you're going to have the boat here and have all this open space ahead of it. It gives that boat room to, theoretically move. Whereas if the boat is right here against the edge of the frame, that creates a lot of tension because it's about to hit the edge of the frame. Sometimes that's a great effect. It just depends on the mood that you're trying to go after. In this case, we don't want that tension. We want to see, where the direction of his gaze is going. Same thing here. It's a vertical image. The eyes, especially the dominant eye. The dominant eye is just the one that's closest to the camera. That's all. The dominant eye is dead smack right on that impact point. Much stronger than putting this little face probably right in the middle of that frame. So here we have, and this is a little bit beyond, the rule of thirds isn't exact. It doesn't have to be exactly right on those lines in order to work, but this one's pretty close to that impact point that's on the quadrant number 3, lower left. makes this whole image a little more interesting. Same thing here. This is actually a self-portrait. The guy's shooting, his camera's on a tripod and he's shooting his reflection. But his placement allows us to enjoy the rest of the image instead of focusing just directly on him. This one I like. This one could satisfy a couple of different compositional elements. It could be simplicity, it could be balance, could be rule of thirds, it could be contrast. I mean, the more of them you hit in a single image, the more impact that image is going to have. But if we look at this strictly as rule of thirds, yeah, it makes sense. I love the fact that he's in shadow. I mean, look how well this was done. He's a silhouette, but he's backlit by, he's standing in the shadowed area. He's backlit by the lighter area of those dunes, which just absolutely makes him stand out. If he'd been a little further to the left and been in the shadow, this image has nowhere near the impact. The fact that he's created a silhouette by choosing the viewpoint that he did makes this so much more incredible. Balance is like what we were talking about before. In addition to rule of thirds, if I come in like this and I've got a background element that's balancing against me in one way or another, if they have equal weight in mass, or if they tell a story together or something like that, that's what creates balance. So there's not much in this image except for this sign and this building. So they do balance each other against all of this open blue sky. Here's another example of balance. The subject is the foreground subject. Again, using the rule of thirds in two different ways here. The subject is at an impact point, and so is the bridge in the background. And because of that, they balance against each other. This wouldn't work if she was over directly underneath the bridge. Even though she would technically be in a rule of thirds position, and so would the bridge, it just wouldn't have the same, wouldn't have that balance to it at all. Everything would be heavily overloaded on the left side of the frame. A couple other things that come into play here that I'll mention. Viewpoint has something to do with it here. If you notice, there are reflections in the water of the cables on the top of that bridge. And notice that I shot this just high enough that those reflections don't intersect with her head. Her head is, the background behind her head is that smooth water. If her head was a little bit higher in the frame and that was kind of coming out of both ears, it wouldn't have a very pleasing effect. So it had to be up just a little bit higher to keep that from happening. If I was much lower, then her head would have been, you know, with the trees and the reflection in the background, it just wouldn't have popped out nearly as much. So a lot of thought goes into composition, or should go into composition, in ways that make an image have more impact. Contrast can be not only luminance, but color contrast. In this case, we're looking at color contrast. Reds and greens are opposites, and so having a green background makes the red pop out a lot more. If this was in black and white, and that background would render very light, and the flowers very dark, or vice versa, then we'd have a luminance contrast. In this case, we're looking at color contrast. This is probably one of my favorites, is leading lines. The thing you have to remember about leading lines, and this is something that a lot of people miss, is you not only have to have a line, it actually has to lead somewhere, meaning there has to be a subject somewhere in the frame. If there were no people, no cars on this road, it would still be an okay image, but we wouldn't have a subject to look at. In this case, our eye comes in from the left-hand side, again, because we read from left to right, and we follow that snaked line around until we get sort of in the center, but it is the upper third where those cars are, and that's why the subject's been placed there. And then it goes out of the image in the upper left. And theoretically, your eye can just kind of come back around again and come in from the bottom left and keep traveling along that road. It's not a road I think I'd want to drive, to be honest with you. I've been on a lot of roads like that. West Virginia has roads like that. So let's look at leading lines a little bit more closely. So here we have these wooden, it's a boat launch, and the wooden pieces of this boat launch are sort of acting as leading lines. They're leading us down to the boat, down to the water. But there is a little bit of a problem here, again, because in Western society, we read from right to, or from left to right. We kind of want to see things the same way. So if you flip this image, it really helps that, because now we have room, like our eyes come in where it feels natural, and there's room in here for it to grow. If we go back, whoops, sorry. If we go back to that, it just, our eye comes in from the left still, and the lines kind of stop us in place over there. It stops us from really enjoying this. In this case, it just feels more natural. So when you're dealing with composition, recognize that this is an option that you have. You can flip an image horizontally or vertically if you want to. You just have to be careful that there's like no words or writing or anything in an image that's going to flip as well. In this case, there aren't, and so it just makes the composition work a lot better. Look where that boat is. It's at the intersection of the rule of thirds in the upper right quadrant, and the lines are leading us right into that area. Here's another example of it. We have this beautiful leading line, the fence coming in. We have a lot of things going on here. We have balance, we have symmetry, we have simplicity, but we also have it coming from the wrong side. If you put it over here, now our eye more naturally follows the line of that fence and finds that subject that sort of looks like, now that I look at it, sort of looks like the Exorcist. I don't know why that popped into my head, but it's kind of what he reminds me of. Another leading line, this is a very long exposure near a train track. Let me make a comment before we go on, by the way, about train tracks. So one of the compositional elements is convergence, and it's where two or more lines not only lead into an image, but they intersect at a point, and they lead your eye to that point. Well, because of that, a lot of people like to photograph on railroad tracks. Don't do it. It's illegal, for number one. This is either federal or private property, so it's illegal to do, and it's dangerous as hell. You might not know this, but every single day in this country, at least one person is killed on railroad tracks because they're not where they're supposed to be. And a lot of those people, believe it or not, are doing photographs on railroad tracks. I have actually seen images of people doing newborn photos on a railroad track, putting a newborn baby in the middle of a railroad track. I can't think of anything dumber than that, but there's a lot of that out there. So in this case, they didn't go on the tracks, they photographed from the side of the tracks. It's still a dangerous place to be because the proximity is pretty close. But notice what's happened here. They've used these leading lines not only of the tracks, but of the trail of lights on the train to lead in from the left and then circle around back to the, from the left, circle around back to the left. A couple of other cool things that have happened is that the headlight on that engine, on the locomotive, has created lighting on the track, and you can see the shadow on the near side of the track that's created by that. It's created highlights on the top of the track. A lot of really cool things going on here. This was shot obviously at a very narrow aperture. You can tell that because the lights, all of the point light sources in the image have that star-shaped pattern to them that are actually in the shape of the aperture. You don't get that if you're at a wider aperture, but you do when you're at smaller ones. So it's a pretty cool shot. It's just a dangerous one. This is another one, staircases, especially these spiral ones, tend to lead your eye. There's really no subject here. If there was somebody standing at the top of those steps with some contrasting clothing looking down, this would have been a lot more powerful. But as an art piece, as an abstract or something like that, it does work. This is another one, same idea, just using the leading line of the steps. Lucky enough that there was a very large window on the right side of this image to provide some nice soft but directional light, and it lights up the spine, the spindles on that staircase all the way down, also lights up the couple pretty well. Convergence. So this is pretty much what we mean when we talk about convergence. We are leading to a single point, okay? Something in the image is coming into a single point and leading our eye to that. A leading line kind of leads you to your subject, or it leads you through the image, but it doesn't necessarily, everything in the image doesn't lead to one focal point. So that's kind of the difference between the two. So this is another one. This is, again, you might look at it and say leading lines. Yeah, you're kind of right. But it's really more about convergence, because all of those, you know, he looks like he's underneath, I don't know, like the framework of a teepee or something, looking down and shooting up. Terrible lighting, but the composition is interesting. So let's look at where some of this comes from. We didn't make this up. You know, the people that invented photography didn't just say, well, you know, this is going to be better if you do it this way. We actually take most of the inspiration for this from the old masters and the Renaissance painters and the Impressionists as well. They all did kind of the same things. So look at this image of the Mona Lisa. So there's a couple of things done here that are no accident. Number one, if you look at the way she's dressed, so that her face and chest, the skin tone at the top, and her hands, if you ignore most of the background because her hair separates her face there, those are the brightest points of the image. If you squint, that's what you see. You see her skin tone. And the fact that she has dark clothing in between her chest and her hands creates this triangular shape. And it gives us that contrast to make her skin tone stand out. Everything else is very subdued for a reason. He wanted this, obviously, to make the skin and the face stand out. So this is kind of where it starts. And also the way the arms are angled gives us that triangle. In photography and in art in general, diagonals and triangles are very, very powerful. They're very impactful. Verticals and horizontals, much less so. You're typically better off if you can create a triangle or a diagonal than a straight line up or down. So here's an example of that, using kind of the same thing, posing a couple so that we create this triangle, and it puts their faces, you know, at the end of that open triangle, so that we come in, we see that arm, which is very bright, set against the dark jacket, and it leads our eye right up into the faces. And there's the triangle that we're looking at. So again, triangle is, it's very common, but it's also a powerful compositional tool. So here is a little family example, and let me give you a little tip if you ever get asked to take pictures of multiple people. Keep these techniques in mind, but the main thing to remember is that you don't want any adjacent heads, that is, two heads that are right next to each other. You don't want them on the same height level. You want them different. So if you look, mom and the little boy, he's down below her, dad's up above her. The little girl is actually, all four of them are actually on separate planes. If the little girl and the mother had been on the same level, that's still okay because they're not adjacent heads. We've got two heads in between them. So here's our triangle. There's one triangle, and there's another triangle, and then the entire shape kind of creates a diamond shape. Here's another example. And you can say, well, the front line or the middle row, there's adjacent heads, but they're not. They're broken up by the ones that are in the middle. And look at all the triangles we have in this image. And then the entire image is a triangle. So when I'm posing groups, as long as I keep two things in mind, number one, don't let adjacent heads be on the same level. And number two, try to create triangles out of my composition. I know that I've got a winner as far as the look of that image goes. So here's some old masters images. This first one, kind of the rule of thirds, a little bit of balance as well. The building in the background balancing against the people in the canoe. This is an impressionist image. And the canoe is going into the image, so it's got all this room in front of it to move. Here's another one overlaid with a rule of thirds. A lot of open area to the right, but it makes that little cabin or that little house feel like it's got a lot of space in front of it. And here's a similar example. This is anybody ever been to Sedona in Arizona? It's a cool place. You ever get a chance to go there? If you love art, it's such an eclectic little artist community, and it's beautiful too. It's kind of on the small side, but there's a lot to offer there. So this is in Sedona. This is shot from a place called Cathedral, or Cathedral Rock. Actually, there is an actual church that is cut out of the rock. There's a cliff behind me, and they've actually just hollowed it out and made a church out of it. And so I was standing up there and I saw this house, which, by the way, the guest house in this house is bigger than my house. That's the guest house down to the left. This house has an observatory in it. Can you see that at the top? And the really strange thing is that the guy who built this house, I don't know if he still lives there, but the guy who built this house is the guy who invented the MRI. Now think about that for a minute. An MRI, unless you're in an open MRI, it's like this closed-in little thing. And look at all this space he's got. But there's balance here. So we've got rule of thirds because of the placement of the house and sort of where the rocks are. We've got balance between the two. They sort of play off each other. Again, wouldn't work if the house was directly underneath those rock formations. They have to be sort of opposite. Now it creates a diagonal between the two. Even the shadows coming down at that diagonal help. And there's our overlay. You can see that house kind of sits right on that lower right quadrant. All right, is that it for this? Let me see. Yeah, I have had a couple of other things in here, but I think we're going to stop there as far as composition is concerned. I don't want to get any more confusing along those lines. Let me get back into this for a second here. 603. All right. So we might actually, please don't all get upset, but we might actually wrap up a little early here. Can just see the unbridled joy in your faces. You two, between the rat and you're just having way too much fun with this. And Jacob's the quiet one. Jacob doesn't say much, but he's consistently turning in stuff that I think by the end of the semester, there's a couple of you, and I think Jacob's one. Eva's another one. Chris has already got a good handle on the technical stuff. I think we're all going to get there, but there's a couple of you that are really, you guys, though, are going to be my comedians. I think if we get humor in an image, it's going to be from the two of you, and you're probably going to collaborate on it. So let's talk a little bit about the assignment for next week. So looking at the first 5 compositional elements, which, if I can remember, were rule of thirds, balance, leading lines, convergence, and contrast, I think was the other one. Thinking about those 5, what I'm going to have you do is to try to take a photograph that illustrates each one of those compositional elements. Technically, I would like you, instead of shooting these in manual mode, I'd like you to shoot them in aperture priority. I want to start getting you used to that, and use that exposure compensation when necessary. If you're photographing something that's overly light or overly dark and your exposure's not right, use the exposure compensation to make it right. And so we're looking at 5 images, but literally if you walk outside and turn around in a 360-degree arc, I'm sure that you can find 5 things that probably hit those compositional elements. So we want to keep, again, as always, as we go through this stuff, we want to remember everything we've done before. So we want to nail the exposure. We want, obviously, to satisfy the assignment, we want the composition to be, a good composition. We want to take those, shoot them in RAW, take them into a RAW file processor if you're able, and tweak them. Make them look as colorful as possible, or as, make sure you, if the exposure, if there's something about it that isn't quite perfect, you can adjust it in there. we're starting to get to the point now where we want to see these images that you're turning in start to look more saturated, more detailed, exposure done correctly, and all of that. So everything we've done and everything we've talked about up till now, we're going to start building into that. Let me think. Oh, the other thing is the 5 images that you submit. It would help a lot because there is some crossover. Name each image by what it is. In other words, you'll have an image called rule of thirds, an image called balance, an image called contrast, and so forth. So I know what it is you were going for. Usually it's pretty obvious, it's pretty apparent, but just so that I know exactly what you were going for in case there's some crossover like between convergence and leading lines, just name them that way. And I will post this in great detail again tonight, but at least you have a starting point. Definitely make sure you read that in case I change something. I don't ever do that on purpose, by the way. I don't ever go, I'm going to change this up just to see if they're reading that. No, I wouldn't do that. But sometimes I have another idea or a better idea or a refinement or something as I'm going through. So just make sure you watch that or you read that. All right, so today we did, you guys did really well with white balance overall. I was pretty happy with that. I think the concept is one that you really have down pretty quickly. We did a little review. I do see that there's some room for improvement in figuring out that exposure chart and how things play against each other. So keep that in mind as you go through. You want to work on that. And then we looked at the first 5 compositional elements, and we're going to have you guys illustrate those. So if you're really not adventurous, but there is a word for this and it just left my head. Let's just call it smart. If you're really smart, this class has about 40 minutes left in it. You could take that 40 minutes and go nail your assignment right now, and then you wouldn't be straggling at the last minute to try to get it done. Because I know when you do things last minute, and most of you have been pretty good about getting them in at least like the day before, but when you do them later and later, you tend to throw it together quickly just to try to get it done. If you go out in the next 40 minutes and shoot even 1 or 2 of these concepts, chances are by the time you submit them or get ready to submit, you're going to look at those images and go, you know what, I can make them better. And you're going to go back and do them again. So the more often you do that, the more time you have to do that, the better they are in the long run. Do we have, it is almost 6:10. Before I cut you guys loose, are there any questions at all, either about the assignment or about anything that we talked about tonight?
Do you want the raw photos along with the edited ones?
It doesn't have to be the raw file. It doesn't have to be like the CR2, the raw file. But if you export that as a JPEG before you do anything to it, that would be great. That would be nice to be able to see where you started from and where you went to.
Okay.
So essentially you'll have 10 images if you do that, but only 5 of them are unique. Got it. Thank you. Good question. Anything else? Well, I don't know if it's going to get as cold tonight as it did last night. I went from wearing shorts and a t-shirt to long pants and a jacket today. So I think the rest of this week's going to be a little on the cool side. But if there's any decent daylight or weather out there, go enjoy it for the last half hour or so, and find something to shoot. And we'll talk to you guys in a week. Bye, guys.